I harbor the fear, not that I have any kind of betting interest in the presidential race, because I'm an objective journalist and I just report the facts, but that Obama's support for transgender rights in North Carolina and elsewhere has the potential to be seen as harming the Democrats' chances, and if the worst possible outcome of a Trump presidency occurs, that people will look back and say, that's why. And that's happened in the past with, quote unquote, social issues, where the Democrats' position on issues that were seen as out of step with mainstream America, that it costs them the White House, it costs them Congress, and then the consequence, obviously, as part of the argument is that, well, not only did you lose the race, but you lost the ability to, in fact, protect the people that you were trying to protect. Is that a danger here? Is that a danger we should even be worried about because there's a simple question of right or wrong?
That sounds like a narrative that's often pushed onto things. I mean, when Proposition 8 was voted on in California and failed, is fail the right term? It was
enacted.
Right.
To the detriment of...
To the failure
exactly.
of progress.
Yeah.
Right.
The vote was blamed on black people in California. It simply wasn't true.
Right.
And yet, somehow, that narrative really took hold.
Blamed on black people who came out to vote for Obama, which is the other part of it, right?
Yeah, and it simply wasn't true. But somehow that narrative was so juicy, was so attractive, that it took hold with people who really should have known better. And I think, this issue it's a classic wedge issue. It's something that's happened before with Don't Ask, Don't Tell, with same-sex marriage, where Democrats, I believe Hillary Clinton supports the right of trans people to use the bathroom, but she's a politician who needs to win an election, and she knows that the gays are going to vote for her. So should she risk the votes of people who are unenlightened about trans people's right to pee in peace?
And the people who are really paying attention will note that Trump doesn't really have a problem with trans people either. Said that Caitlyn Jenner could use whichever bathroom in Trump Tower she preferred. It's not a choice between a Ted Cruz and a perfect progressive. Yeah.
And the idea of what mainstream America is up for debate. I mean, Trump is playing to an idea of what it will be for another 20 years or so. But as I did a video about this a couple weeks ago, the white majority is coming to an end in only 27 years and counting. But the Obama coalition and what Clinton, if she doesn't mess it up too much, will probably be the Clinton coalition, is probably going to be one that's pretty supportive of trans rights. I mean, if you look at this down by age, they're overwhelmingly supportive of trans rights and LGBT rights. And even Mitt Romney won more elderly white votes than even Ronald Reagan did, and he did not say as well as Richard Nixon, having overwhelming majorities in the South, but he had a pretty conservative coalition. He still didn't win. So I think that history is on the side. They're not going to be able to have these kinds of wedge issues. There'll be different ones, but they won't be able to have these kinds of wedge issues for too many more elections.
So let's talk about LGBT issues in the presidential race and focus on the Democratic side, where there still is a primary contest. We can have another show about whether that's still a viable contest or not. But is there any daylight on these issues when it comes to Senator Sanders versus Secretary Clinton? Or are they broadly in sync on this, at least now?
I think they're broadly in sync. Just having looked at the platforms on their websites, Sanders is sort of short and sweet, but a good umbrella. Clinton's is very detailed and it's sort of exhaustive, and that sort of strikes me as sort of like
fitting, right? I mean, that's what you would expect.
She's the wonk, and he's the go from the gut, guy. So there isn't a whole lot of daylight. I do take exception to the idea that Sanders was, here when Clinton was here for such a long time, because they both only very recently came out in favor of marriage equality, for example, him in 2009 and Clinton in 2011. They're both, as all national politicians of note, have been all Johnny-come-latelys. So, they're both there now, and I think we should embrace them and be grateful for that. But it took them both a while, I think, because they are politicians.
Right.
I think that there's not a huge difference between them in a presidential sense. I think he's better on economics. She's much better on tactics. and thinking of how they've approached AIDS. She had that horrific, Reagan praising, which gave him the best in that he's completely blown.
That's true.
And she had a meeting last week with 20 heads of AIDS organizations. He canceled the meeting that he was supposed to have, which was just awful. I can't excuse that, even though I voted for him, and I write for a left-wing British newspaper, so I can say who I vote for. And at the same time, I think that I do believe he is better if you look sort of economic vision-wise, and the more I've studied about HIV epidemiologically, it very much ties into economics, to universal health care, to things like that, but I think he is much further along than she is. I think she has sort of wonky policy ideas about how to deal with things, but if you sort of dealt with the economy more broadly, then I think actually HIV would be in a better place.
So Donald Trump has said many things in the campaign, but I think as we've alluded to before, perhaps it has been perceived as not as unfriendly to LGBT issues and to that community as some prospective Republican nominees of the past. Do we trust that is actually where he is, given that he can be a bit, informal about his approach to policy?
I don't trust it at all. I mean, I think he will happily take the endorsements of a certain class of rich gay people, but as we have clearly seen, he is very hostile towards Mexican LGBT people, African American LGBT people, disabled and differently abled LGBT people, immigrant LGBT people, Muslim LGBT people. So I think he's just going to be a disaster. And of course, for women overall, he's a disaster.